Hello, my moonlit wanderers. I've been working on something behind the scenes that I'm so excited about. And next week, I finally get to share it with all of you. So make sure you're following the channel. You won't want to miss this one. So, tonight, we are looking at the one who stood in doorways. The one who kept rooms ready and doors open and love unconditional through everything the darkness brought. The Cullen everyone overlooked. The one hiding in plain sight. Holding an entire family of immortals together with something no gift could name. The theories about Esme Cullen. So, get comfortable now. Pull the covers a little closer. Esme has been waiting quietly in the background long enough. There is a particular kind of person who holds a room together without ever claiming it. You have met them, or you have felt their absence when they were gone. That sudden awareness that the warmth in a space was never the room itself, but the person inside it. The gathering that felt effortless until the one who made it effortless was no longer there. And everyone stood around with their drinks and their conversations, and slowly understood that something essential had departed with her. The food was still on the table. The music was still playing. But the reason the evening had felt like something worth attending was gone. And no one could quite articulate why. Because they had never quite articulated what she was doing in the first place. Esme Cullen is that person. She's always been that person. And for the better part of 5 books and 5 films, the Twilight saga allowed her to remain exactly that. Present, warm, peripheral, and almost entirely unexplored. She was the room temperature of the Cullen family. The thing everyone inhabited without thinking about where it came from. She appears in Twilight the way a childhood home appears in memory. You do not see her arrive. She is simply there, already part of the scene, already oriented toward whoever needs her most. When Bella Swan walks into the Cullen house for the first time, uncertain and overwhelmed, and doing her best not to show either, carrying the particular kind of self-consciousness that comes from walking into a space where you are acutely aware of being assessed. It is Esme who crosses the room to meet her, not to assess her, not to interrogate her, not to make clear the conditions under which she might be found acceptable, simply to welcome her. She takes Bella's hands. She says she is so glad Bella came, and she means it. That is the thing about Esme that the saga establishes immediately and never really examines. She always means it. There is no performance in her warmth. There is no strategy. She is glad Bella came because Bella is someone Edward loves, and that is sufficient, completely, and without qualification. While Rosalie holds herself apart with barely contained resentment, positioned across a room like a beautiful weather system that has decided to be a cold front, while Jasper maintains his careful, controlled distance near the doorway with the stillness of someone who has learned that stillness is the only reliable form of safety, while Alice bounces with that particular brand of excited familiarity that is as much about her own visions as it is about Bella herself. Esme is simply present, warm, making the impossible situation as possible as she can through the application of genuine, uncomplicated feeling. She cooks food no one will eat. This detail is easy to pass over as charming eccentricity, the vampire family playing house, and there is something of that in it. But there is also something else. The act of preparing food for someone is an act of care so ancient and so fundamental that it communicates warmth across every language barrier and every cultural difference that has ever existed between human beings. Esme knows that Bella cannot eat what she has prepared the way Bella needs to eat. She prepares it anyway, because the preparation itself is the message, because she wants Bella to walk into that kitchen and smell something that says someone here was thinking about you before you arrived. She decorates rooms with extraordinary care, considering the light through each window, the weight of each fabric, the history of each piece of furniture she has rescued and restored. She tends to the family with the same attention she gives to the houses, finding what is beautiful in what others have overlooked, making it visible, making it last. She worries. This is perhaps the most human thing about her, or the most vampirically amplified human thing. The worry that never fully rests, the vigilance of a person who loves without self-protection and therefore carries the vulnerability of everyone she loves as if it were her own. When Edward is in pain, Esme feels it. When Rosalie rages, Esme absorbs it without flinching. When Jasper struggles, Esme remains steady in a way that is not the steadiness of someone who does not feel the difficulty, but the steadiness of someone who has decided that her feelings are not the most important ones in the room right now. She notices when something is wrong before anyone has said a word. She says the right thing, and then she steps back and lets people find their own way, which is perhaps the most difficult and most loving thing a person can do. Harder, in many ways, than the dramatic interventions and the fierce protections. The capacity to see someone struggling and offer presence rather than solution, warmth rather than instruction, and then trust them to find their footing. She does this consistently across the entire saga, without it ever being named or celebrated as the extraordinary skill it is. This is the Esme most fans carry: maternal, beautiful, warm, the one who hugs Bella when the others hesitate, the one who keeps the house, the Cullen wife. And it is true. All of it is true, but it is the way that a foundation is true, essential, structural, holding up everything above it, and almost entirely invisible precisely because the things it supports are so much more immediately visible than the thing doing the supporting. But before the theories, before the reframe, the canon. Because the canon is where everything begins, and Esme's canon, examined carefully and completely, is more extraordinary than most readers pause long enough to see. Esme Ann Platt was born in 1895 in Columbus, Ohio, into the particular circumstances of a middle-class family in the American Midwest at the turn of the century. The world she was born into had very clear ideas about what a woman's life should contain and in what order those contents should arrive. Childhood managed carefully, education sufficient but not excessive, marriage arranged or strongly guided by family to a man of appropriate standing, children, home, the performance of domestic contentment as a form of social virtue. These were not offered as options. They were the shape of the life available to her. She was, by the accounts woven through the saga's extended material, a girl who felt things deeply and completely. She climbed trees. She was more interested in the bones of old buildings, the way a roof line was constructed, the logic of a load-bearing arch, the particular grammar of Victorian interior design, than in the domestic accomplishments her era valued in young women. She was not a rebel. She did not have the language for rebellion, and her circumstances did not offer the structural support for it. She was simply herself, which in 1895 Ohio was often enough to make a person quietly extraordinary and quietly lonely in equal measure. When she was 16 years old, she broke her leg climbing a tree and was brought to a young doctor named Twilight Cullen. She remembered him afterward. This is a small detail in the saga, offered almost in passing, and it is worth dwelling on far longer than the saga allows it to breathe. She was 16 and in pain and frightened, sitting in a clinic that smelled of antiseptic and damp wool coats, and what she carried away from that experience was not the memory of the pain or the fear or the inconvenience. It was the doctor, his extraordinary gentleness, the quality of his attention, the way he looked at her as if she were a person whose experience of pain mattered, which was not the most common quality in medical practitioners of the early 20th century. Something in him that she recognized without being able to name, the way you sometimes recognize a piece of music you have never heard before, because it is in a key you somehow already know. She carried that memory for years. She had no reason to believe she would ever see him again. She kept it anyway. This is the first thing the fan theories want you to understand about Esme. She has always been someone who keeps things, who holds on to the beautiful and the true past, the point where pragmatism would suggest letting go. This quality will matter enormously later. What followed her childhood was what followed for many women of her era. A marriage arranged by her family to a man named Charles Evenson, who was respected in the community in the ways that matter for her reputation, and cruel in the home in the ways that leave no visible marks on the skin, and all of their marks everywhere else. The abuse was real and sustained, and the kind that operates through the systematic dismantling of a person's sense of their own reality. What you felt did not happen. What happened was your fault. What you remember is wrong. Esme endured it for years. She endured it because endurance was what her circumstances offered her, because leaving was not simply a decision a woman in a position could make and carry through without consequences that reached every direction, because her family had sanctioned this marriage and the world around her had built its walls to keep her inside it. And then, sometime around 1917, she left anyway. She went to her parents. She told them what was happening, and they sent her back to Charles Evenson, because in 1917, that was the thing parents did, and it was among the worst things they ever did, and they could not have fully understood what they were returning her to. Or perhaps they chose not to understand, which is a different and more complicated failure. The pregnancy that followed gave her hope. It often does, and it often should not. And Esme was wise enough and desperate enough to hold both truths simultaneously. The baby was born, a boy. He lived 3 days. 3 days of his small heart beating in the particular determined way that new hearts beat, working very hard at the extraordinary business of being alive. And then it stopped, quietly, the way small hearts sometimes stop when the world is simply too large and too cold for them yet. And Esme's own heart broke in a way that 3 days of impossible love made absolute and permanent. Not a fracture, a dissolution. The thing that had been holding her together for years in that house, in that life, the hope of him, and then the brief reality of him, was simply gone. She left again. This time she did not go to her parents. She went to Ashland, Wisconsin, and she found a cliff, and in the early months of 1921, she jumped. She was 26 years old. She had spent a decade being diminished by a man she had never chosen. She had lost the only person she had chosen 3 days after meeting him. She had been alive for 26 years without being given very much of what makes life livable. And the theories explored tonight want to begin here, at this cliff, because this is where everything the fan community finds most interesting about Esme is rooted. She did not jump from the cliff because she felt nothing. She jumped because she had felt everything, completely, without adequate shelter or return, for long enough that the weight of it had become more than her human structure could carry. This is not emptiness. This is the extremity of a person whose capacity for feeling has always been larger than the life available to contain it. The morgue in Ashland admitted her body that evening. The death certificate was being prepared. She was, by every reasonable medical assessment of 1921, beyond any possibility of survival. And then Carlisle Cullen arrived. He was working at the hospital. He was always working at hospitals in those years, moving from city to city, staying long enough to be genuinely useful, and not long enough for anyone to notice that he never aged, that he never ate, that his skin was always precisely the same temperature as the room. He had not been looking for her. He did not know she was there. But he found her in that cold room, and he recognized her, the girl from the clinic, 10 years older and 10 years harder. And he stood beside the gurney and listened to the heartbeat that was still, impossibly faintly present. And he made a decision. He chose to save her, in the only way available to him. He carried her from the hospital with a particular speed that no one observing him could quite account for. And he brought her somewhere quiet and dark. And he did what he had done only twice before, and never without an enormous weight of conscience. He bit her. He introduced the venom. He stepped back and waited through 3 days of fire that she could not voice, but that consumed her from the inside in the way all transformations do, systematically, completely, leaving nothing of the original structure except the essential bones. And on the third day, Esme Ann Platt opened new eyes in the cool dark and looked at the face of the man she had carried in memory for 10 years, and she understood immediately what had happened, what she was, what this meant. "You were in pain," Carlisle told her, his voice careful and full of genuine sorrow. "I hope you can forgive me for this." Esme looked at him for a long moment. She was receiving the world at full vampire volume. Every heartbeat in the building, every molecule of blood moving through every vein within a considerable radius, the 1,000 overwhelming stimuli of a body that had been rebuilt into something that perceived everything at maximum intensity. She understood what the thirst was. She understood what she was. And she said simply, and without apparent internal conflict, that there was nothing to forgive, that she was grateful, that she remembered him from the clinic, that she had always remembered him. This is the origin of the Cullen family's emotional center, and it is worth sitting with fully before the theories begin to layer themselves over it, because everything that the family would become, the unprecedented thing it is within the entire vampire world the saga describes, this chosen family of broken and extraordinary people who stay together not out of hierarchy or fear or obligation, but out of something that looked remarkably like love. Everything traces back to this moment. This woman waking from death, choosing immediately and without visible hesitation to embrace the life she found herself inside. She did not rage against it the way Rosalie would rage against her own transformation years later. She did not spiral into self-loathing and isolation the way Edward would in the years before and long after his own transformation. She woke up and she looked at Carlisle and she was grateful, and then she built something extraordinary out of that gratitude. Not because it was easy or because she was simple, but because she had already survived the hardest things her human life could produce, and she knew, with the bone-deep knowledge of someone who has genuinely lost everything, what it looked like to waste the time you were given. Now consider what the saga gives each Cullen in terms of narrative attention, and sit with what that distribution reveals. Edward is the romantic lead, the philosophical heart, the voice through which the mythology is first constructed and then expanded across 600,000 words of canon material. His interiority is rendered in extraordinary depth. Rosalie receives one of the saga's most affecting extended flashbacks. Jasper's history as a Confederate soldier and commander of newborn armies is given real space and treated with genuine seriousness. Alice's missing years become plot material. Carlisle's 3 centuries of ethical vampirism form the philosophical backbone of everything. And Esme moves through all of it. Present, warm, peripheral, almost entirely unexplored. Referenced more than she has seen. Atmospheric rather than examined. The fan theories that have accumulated around her are, at their most serious and most careful, an act of looking, of taking the available evidence and asking what it actually suggests about the interior life of a woman who has been treated as the emotional temperature of the house, rather than as a person who generates that temperature through specific, extraordinary, and largely invisible work. What the theories find, when they look carefully, is someone remarkable, not despite the warmth and the open arms and the food no one eats. Because of it, because of what it reveals, once you understand the history behind it, about the magnitude of what she chose, about the kind of love that survives a cliff, and the transformation, and the century of immortal life without losing a single degree of its warmth. She is the Cullen everyone overlooked. The question tonight is why, and what it cost everyone not to look more carefully, and what we find when we finally do. There is a theory that sits at the heart of everything else explored tonight, and it begins with a question that the Twilight saga raises without ever fully answering. When Carlisle Cullen transformed Edward Mason in 1918, when he transformed Esme Platt in 1921, when he eventually brought Rosalie and Emmett and the others into the family, he was carefully and deliberately building. What exactly was he doing to them? Not medically, not physically. The physical process is documented in the canon with reasonable clarity. The venom, the 3 days, the fire, the silence at the end when the heart finally stops and something new opens its eyes in the dark. What the theory asks is something different and something deeper. What was happening to them as people? What did the transformation actually take? And what did it actually give? And is there a pattern in the exchange that the saga gestures toward repeatedly, but never fully traces to its conclusion? Carlyle believed he knew the answer. He had thought about it for 3 centuries before he began building his family, which is a considerable amount of time to develop a theory, and the conclusion he arrived at was one he held with the quiet conviction of someone who has tested an idea against reality for long enough that the testing and the believing have become the same thing. The transformation does not create, it amplifies. It finds the most essential frequency a person broadcasts, the deepest, most defining quality of who they are at their core, the thing that would remain if everything else were stripped away. And it turns that frequency up until it becomes something beyond human scale, something that operates on a different register entirely, something that, in the right circumstances and in the right person, looks like a gift. He explains this to Edward in the early years of Edward's vampire life, sitting together in whatever house they are occupying at the time. Carlyle patient and precise, and Edward still raw with the strangeness of what he has become, still working out the relationship between the boy he was and the thing he is now. I have come to believe, Carlyle says, his voice carrying the particular careful weight of a man who has chosen every word, that we do not lose ourselves in the transformation. We become more fully ourselves than we were ever able to be as humans. The things most essentially ours, they survive. They more than survive. Edward thinks about this for a long moment, listening without meaning to the thoughts of the people in the street outside, the ambient noise of human consciousness that he is still learning to manage. And the things that are not essentially ours, those, Carlyle says quietly, are what the fire takes. Work through the established examples carefully, because the pattern is real, and it matters enormously for what the theory eventually says about Esme. Each case deserves its full weight. Edward Mason was 17 years old when the influenza found him, and he was already, in those 17 years, something genuinely remarkable. A boy with a mind that moved faster than the people around him, that made connections others missed, that noticed the thing beneath the thing, the precise quality of a person's discomfort, the gap between what a face showed and what a face meant, the small reveals that most people's attention slides past without registering. He was a reader, a musician, someone for whom the interior life of other people was a constant source of fascination and something approaching compulsion. He could not stop noticing, could not stop picking up signals that most people did not even know they were broadcasting. He was perceptive in the way that some people simply and fundamentally are, as if their nervous system is tuned to receive on frequencies that the standard human instrument can access. The transformation took that perceptiveness and made it literal in the most radical possible way. He did not merely notice what people were feeling beneath what they were saying. He heard what they were thinking in their own voices, with their own specific vocabulary, with all the texture and contradiction and involuntary revelation that actual thought contains, as opposed to the edited version people offer aloud. Every mind around him became a radio broadcasting on a frequency only he could receive, and he could not turn it off. and the gift and the burden were identical and inseparable. But the gift did not come from nowhere. It came from him. It was him, turned all the way up, operating at a level his human nervous system could never have sustained. Jasper Whitlock's case is in some ways the most instructive, because the amplification is the most dramatic and the most legible. Jasper was a soldier and a leader, and the quality that made him exceptional at both was his ability to read the people around him with an accuracy that went beyond training or experience. He knew when his troops were breaking before they broke, before the visible signs appeared, before anyone had said a word about it. He knew when the enemy was wavering before the waver became a movement, before it became anything a tactician could point to on a map. He knew, in the particular way of people whose emotional intelligence is genuinely exceptional, rather than merely competent, what a room full of people was feeling as a collective organism. Not just individually, not just person by person catalogued in sequence, but the mood of the group, the direction it was tending, the tipping point that was approaching from a direction no one was looking. Transformation made this literal and active in ways that changed everything about what Jasper was and what he could do. He did not merely read emotional states, he could alter them. He could send calm through a room the way weather moves in from the coast, gradually, completely, until the people inside it could not remember what tension felt like. He could feel despair or courage or bloodlust, as if they were his own sensations, even when they originated entirely in someone standing across a field from him. The gift was devastating in its reach and its intimacy, and it was entirely and recognizably him. The most essential thing about Jasper Whitlock, made into something that no human scale could have produced or contained. Alice is the most philosophically interesting case, because what she was as a human is the thing we know least about and must infer most carefully from what she became. The asylum, the years she has no memory of, the transformation performed by a vampire whose identity and motivation remain only partially illuminated, done at least in part to protect her from a tracker who had already decided she was interesting enough to pursue. She woke into vampirism without a human past she could access, without the memories that might have told her who she was before she became what she is, and she has spent her entire documented existence building a present and a future without the foundation of a recoverable past. But the theory, working carefully from what Alice is as a vampire, constructs an inference about what she must have been as a human. She was intuitive beyond what intuition usually means. She knew things she should not have been able to know. She felt the shape of what was coming, the way that some people feel weather in their bones. Not with certainty, not with the clarity of actual vision, not with anything she could have defended to a skeptic, but with a consistency and an accuracy that went far beyond coincidence and far beyond what the people around her could credit or accommodate. In the late 19th or early 20th century, this quality would have been called feminine intuition at best. At worst, it would have been called something that required medical management, which may explain the asylum. Transformation made it precognition. The thing she had always half known became something she could actually see, with specificity and reliability that made her the most strategically valuable member of the family in nearly every crisis the saga documents. Now apply the framework to Esme. Apply it seriously, follow it carefully, and resist the temptation to reach for the conclusion before the argument has been fully built. Because this is where the theory becomes something more than a clever pattern. This is where it becomes a genuine claim about the nature of the Cullen family and the source of its extraordinary cohesion. What was Esme's most essential quality as a human? The canon does not hedge on this. Carlyle, who has had a century to observe her, and 3 centuries before that to develop his theory of transformation, speaks about it with the plainness of someone who has thought something through completely and arrived at a conclusion he no longer feels the need to qualify. The thing Esme retained most completely from her human life, he says, was her ability to love, not her intelligence, though she possesses genuine and deep intelligence, not her creativity, though her creative capacity is extraordinary and sustained across an immortal lifetime. Her love, her particular, specific, enormous capacity for love, the quality that was most essentially hers, the frequency she broadcast most deeply, the thing the transformation found and turned all the way up. But the question the fan theory presses, the question that the saga raises the elements of without ever assembling them into a direct answer, is this: what does it mean that love was amplified in Esme, the way telepathy was amplified in Edward, and empathy was amplified in Jasper? What does it actually mean, in practical and structural terms, for a vampire, a being with no fatigue, no biological self-protective failure points, no natural limits imposed by a body that gets tired and a lifespan that enforces perspective? To have the human capacity for love turn all the way up and left running indefinitely. Consider what human love is, even at its most intense and its most devoted. Even the most loving human beings are bounded by human limits in ways they cannot simply decide their way out of. Love is exhausting in the fundamental way that all genuine generosity is exhausting, because it draws on reserves that are finite and that need replenishment. It requires, past a certain point of sustained difficulty, some form of reciprocity to continue sustaining itself. Not because loving people are selfish, but because they are human, and humans cannot pour indefinitely from an empty vessel. Love is vulnerable to self-preservation, which is not a moral failing, but a survival mechanism. People stop loving, or love less completely, when the cost becomes more than their structure can bear. They build walls not out of coldness, but out of the desperate need to remain functional, to have something left for themselves and for the people who depend on them. They learn, across the accumulating weight of a human life with its accumulating disappointments and losses and betrayals, to love somewhat less completely than they once did. Because the person who loved completely and completely got broken has to make a decision about whether they can afford to do that again. Esme does none of this. And this is the observation the theory rests on most heavily, because it is an observation rooted entirely in what the canon actually shows us across 5 books and the companion material. There is not a single moment in the documented history of the Cullen family where Esme's love is conditional. Not a single moment where it is withdrawn in response to difficulty, or placed on hold pending improvement, or measured out in proportion to what is being returned. There is not a moment where she is described as tired of loving someone who is making loving them very hard. There is not a moment of strategic withholding, no moment of protective distance, no moment where she decides that her own emotional survival requires her to pull back from someone who is consuming more than they are giving. She loves Rosalie through decades of bitterness that would have worn down the patience of a saint, through years when Rosalie's resentment bleeds outward into the family's daily life and makes the atmosphere in any room she occupies feel charged and difficult and sharp. Esme absorbs this without flinching, without retaliating, without requiring Rosalie to be different before the warmth is extended. She loves Jasper through years when his presence in the family represents a genuine and ongoing risk. Years when his control is uncertain enough that every social situation is a calculation, every human interaction a potential crisis, every moment of difficulty for anyone in the family a moment of increased danger, because Jasper's empathic gift means he feels everyone else's distress alongside his own. She loves Edward through a century of isolation and self-loathing, and the particular and exhausting experience of loving someone who does not believe, at a very fundamental level, that he deserves to be loved. Someone whose self-punishment is sophisticated enough to find reasons to reject comfort, even as he is receiving it. She loves Bella from the first moment, without conditions, without a probationary period, without requiring Bella to demonstrate her worthiness before the warmth is extended. She loves Alice and Jasper from the moment of their arrival. Strangers with complicated histories, absorbed into the family without a qualifying period, without a trial membership, without anyone requiring them to prove they belonged before they were treated as if they did. This is not a personality trait. It is important to say this clearly, because the tendency when describing Esme is to reach for the vocabulary of personality, warm, maternal, nurturing, as if what she has is a disposition rather than a capacity. Nice people get tired. Warm people have difficult days. Maternal people have limits, even the most devoted ones, because they are human, and humanity has limits built into its biology as a feature rather than a flaw. What Esme demonstrates across a century of documented family life is something that does not map onto personality. It maps onto the framework Carlyle built for understanding what transformation does to the most essential qualities of a person. It maps onto a love that has been amplified past the point where human limits apply. A love that runs on an engine that does not fatigue, directed by a will that has decided once and completely where that love is going. Now build the structural argument, because this is where the theory earns its most radical implication. The Cullen Coven, by every principle of vampire sociology, the saga establishes across its main text and companion material, should not exist in the form it takes. Vampires are solitary, or form small covens built on hierarchy, mutual benefit, and the enforcement of loyalty through power dynamics that have nothing to do with genuine affection. The Volturi's authority rests on fear and the credible and frequently demonstrated threat of total annihilation for non-compliance. The Romanian coven, Vladimir and Stefan, ancient and bitterly nostalgic, rests on shared history, shared defeat, and the particular solidarity of people who have been wronged by the same enemy and have nothing left but each other and their grievance. Nomadic groups like James and Victoria and Laurent are held together by something closer to predatory convenience than anything resembling family feeling. Covens form in the vampire world the saga describes, because individuals are safer in groups and because power consolidates through alliance. They do not form because someone loves everyone in them unconditionally and that love creates a gravitational field strong enough to hold extraordinary and damaged immortals in orbit around a shared home. Except one does. The Cullens. And the question the theory presses is why. Walk through each member's genuine reason to leave, not as a hypothetical, but as a real and documented tension within the family's history. Rosalie's resentment of Edward is deep and long-standing and rooted in something real enough that it resists easy resolution. She did not choose her transformation. She was taken from a human life she had wanted, the children, the future, the ordinary beautiful things she had been promised, and placed into an existence she had never asked for and cannot leave and cannot fully accept. Her resentment is not irrational. It is, in its way, entirely reasonable, and it is directed, at least in part, at Edward, who represents to her the male favoritism she perceives in how Carlyle built the family, the sense that Edward's preferences and Edward's pain were always weighted more heavily than her own. This resentment should, by any reasonable social calculation, make coexistence within a small family unit unsustainable over the long term. It has not made it unsustainable. Something has absorbed it. Something has created enough warmth around Rosalie that she remains, decade after decade, inside a family she resents, because leaving the family would mean leaving something she cannot replace. Jasper's instability in his early decades with the Cullens is not a minor inconvenience to be managed with patience and dietary adjustment. It is a genuine, ongoing risk to the family's security, to the lives of the humans in their immediate environment, and to Jasper's own understanding of himself as someone capable of the life he has chosen. There are years when the question of whether Jasper will remain is genuinely open. Not because he wants to leave, but because he is not sure he can stay without doing something that makes staying impossible. The theory asks what held him through those years. What made the difference between a Jasper who eventually found his stability and a Jasper who gave up on the attempt? The answer it offers is Esme, not her intervention, not her management, but her unconditional acceptance, which told him, in a way that only unconditional acceptance can tell a person, that his presence in the family was not contingent on his success, that he was loved before he got better, and that being loved before you get better is the thing that makes getting better possible. Edward's relationship with the family is the most complex because Edward is simultaneously its founding child and its most chronic absentee. He disappears for years at a stretch. He goes to hunt humans in the 1920s and does not come back until the guilt breaks him. He goes to Alaska when his self-loathing becomes too loud for company. He orbits the family rather than inhabiting it, returning each time to find it still there, still intact, still, and this is the part the theory finds most telling, still willing to receive him without requiring him to account for where he has been or what he has done. This is Esme, not Carlyle, whose welcome is genuine but filtered through philosophy, through the framework of what vampires are and what choices are available to them. Esme's welcome is unfiltered. Edward comes home and she is glad, and her gladness is not conditional on his behavior. And this is the thing that keeps bringing him back when his own self-loathing would otherwise keep him away permanently. Why does any of it hold? Why does the coven cohere? Across decades of movement and difficulty and the specific grinding challenges of being a family of extraordinarily powerful and extraordinarily damaged immortals, who are trying to live by a philosophy that runs directly counter to their most fundamental instincts. The theory's answer is Esme, not as a supporting element of the answer, as the answer. Her amplified, inexhaustible, unconditional love is what functions in the Cullen family, the way gravity functions in a planetary system. Not dramatically, not with any visible exertion, not in ways that call attention to themselves, but as the constant and foundational force that keeps everything in orbit around a shared center rather than flying apart into separate darkness. Without her emotional gravity, the Cullens are a collection of extraordinary and damaged individuals who share a dietary philosophy and a series of addresses. The philosophy alone does not build a family. The shared practice alone does not build a home. What builds a home is someone who makes it one, through the sustained and patient and largely invisible work of loving the people inside it, past the point where loving them is easy. Esme does this work. She's been doing it for nearly a century by the time Bella Swan walks into the Cullen house and feels immediately, and without being able to explain why, that she is somewhere safe. That feeling, that immediate, irrational, accurate sense of safety, is Esme's gift made tangible. It is what the amplified love produces in the environment around it. And it is the thing that makes all the other gifts possible. Because Edward's telepathy is a burden he can only bear inside a family stable enough for him to develop the emotional context to carry it. And Jasper's empathy is a torment he can only survive inside a structure of acceptance that does not require him to be further along than he is. And Alice's visions guide a family rather than isolate a single mind, because the family Esme built is worth guiding, is worth seeing futures for, is worth the extraordinary effort of navigating the difference between what is coming and what can be changed. The fan theory does not call this a power in the formal sense. The saga does not give it an entry in the gift catalogue between telepathy and precognition, but the theory asks whether the absence of that entry is a failure of the catalogue rather than a failure of the gift. Because what the catalogue is tracking is influence, the capacity to shape outcomes, to change what would otherwise happen, to make things possible that would otherwise be impossible. And what Esme has done across a century of immortal family life is make possible the thing that the entire saga depends on. She made the Cullen family, not as its founder, as its sustaining force, as the reason it remained a family instead of becoming something else. Return, finally, to the memory Esme carried from the clinic in Columbus. The 16-year-old girl with the broken leg, sitting in a room that smelled of antiseptic and damp wool, in pain and frightened and doing her best not to show either, who looked at a young doctor and recognized something in him she had no framework to name. She carried that memory for 10 years. She carried it through a marriage that tried systematically to dismantle her sense of her own reality. She carried it through the grief of a baby who lived 3 days. She carried it all the way to the cliff in Ashland, and through the fall, and through 3 days of fire, and out the other side into something vast and strange and permanent. That memory survived everything. And the love that held it, that kept it alive across 10 years of the hardest possible human circumstances, is made of exactly the same material as everything else the theories find when they look closely at Esme Cullen. It is love that does not run out, love that does not calculate what is owed, love that carries things a very long way, through very deep darkness, without knowing what it is carrying them toward. And then, when it finally arrives somewhere, puts them down gently and says, "Here, this is where we stay." There's a detail in the Twilight saga that is easy to pass over because it is presented as background texture rather than as something requiring examination. Esme Cullen holds a degree in architecture. She restores old homes. This is her occupation across the decades the Cullens spend moving between residences, and the saga offers it the way it offers many things about Esme, as charming context, as the kind of detail that makes a character feel inhabited without requiring the reader to think too carefully about what it means. She restores houses. How lovely, how domestic, how entirely in keeping with the warm maternal presence she projects in every scene she occupies, in every room she enters, in every interaction the saga allows her to have before moving its attention back to the characters it considers more central to the story it is telling. The fan theory does not dispute that it is genuine. She genuinely loves this work. That much is clear from every reference the saga makes to it. The absorption she brings to a restoration project, the care she takes with historical detail, the way descriptions of her working carry a quality of complete satisfaction that is rare in how Esme is rendered. As if this is one of the few places the saga allows her to be fully present in her own right rather than in relation to someone else. But the theory asks the question the saga never thinks to ask. Why this? Of all the things an intelligent, creative, immortal woman with unlimited time and resources could pour herself into across the decades, why the specific and consistent practice of finding ruined things and making them whole? Why not creation? Why not the new? Why always, specifically, the damaged and the abandoned and the thing other people have decided is not worth the investment of further care? The answer the theory builds is not about architecture at all. It is about Esme herself, about the deepest pattern of who she is and how she moves through every dimension of her existence, and about the possibility that the houses are not a separate activity from the family, but are the same project expressed in a different material, that she has been doing one thing all along, in wood and stone and in people, and that the consistency of the method across both domains is not coincidence, but the most revealing truth about her character that the saga contains. Begin with the method, because the method is where the theory lives and where it earns its credibility. Esme does not build new structures. This is the first and most important thing to understand about her practice, the thing that distinguishes it from mere creative engagement and makes it philosophically specific. She does not purchase land, commission a design, and construct something from nothing. She does not pursue the new, the blank, the unencumbered canvas. She is not drawn to the creative freedom of starting fresh, of building without the constraint of what was there before. She finds things that have been damaged, houses that were once beautiful, once functional, once full of the particular warmth that comes from being genuinely and fully inhabited by people who loved living inside them, and have since fallen into disrepair through neglect or catastrophe, or simply the indifferent passage of time. Buildings that other people have walked past and assessed as beyond saving, as more trouble than they are worth, as things whose best days are so far behind them that restoration makes less practical sense than demolition and replacement with something that does not carry the burden of its own damage. Esme finds these buildings and she disagrees, quietly, thoroughly, without requiring anyone else to understand or share her assessment. She walks through rooms with collapsed ceilings and warped floorboards and windows that have long since surrendered their glass to weather and vandalism and decades of abandonment. And she does not see what is missing. She sees what is there. She sees what was there before the damage began its work. She sees the original bones of the structure, the intention behind the design, the quality of the materials that have survived despite everything, the particular character of a building that was built by someone who cared, how it would feel to live inside it. She sees what the structure was trying to be before circumstance and neglect and time worked against it. And then she works from those bones outward. She does not tear out what survived and replace it with something cleaner and more manageable and unburdened by history. She preserves the original elements wherever preservation is possible, builds the restoration around what endured, rather than removing the enduring pieces and starting fresh with materials that have no memory of what the building was before. This is her consistent practice, documented across decades of restoration work and multiple properties, and an immortal lifetime of making the same choice over and over, not because it is the easiest or the most efficient method, but because it is the honest one. Because a building that has had its surviving bones replaced with new materials is not a restored building. It is a new building wearing an old building's address. And Esme is not interested in that. She's interested in what was actually there, in what actually survived, in what the original structure was genuinely worth. She's interested in the truth of the building, not the appearance of continuity. This is a philosophy. It is expressed in wood and stone and plaster and lead glass and hand-carved molding. But it is a philosophy, and it is the same philosophy Esme brings to every person she has ever loved. Now apply it character by character, because this is where the theory moves from interpretation to observation, from the plausible to the documented. The pattern is in the canon. It simply has not been assembled in one place before, has not been named for what it is. Begin with Edward, because Edward was first, and because Edward's case establishes the template that every subsequent member of the family will follow in their own way and at their own pace. Edward Anthony Mason arrived in Carlisle's care as a 17-year-old boy dying of influenza in a city that had run out of coffins and was struggling to maintain the social forms of grief at scale. His father was already gone. His mother was dying in the women's ward across the hospital. His entire human future, the university, the law career, the life Elizabeth Mason had imagined for her son, with the particular determined optimism of a woman who believed in futures, had been reduced in the space of days to a matter of hours. He was, in every practical sense, already finished. The world had assessed him and found him beyond the investment of further hope. Carlisle transformed him because Elizabeth asked, and because he could, and because something in the boy on the cot was worth saving in a way that Carlisle felt with enough certainty to act on despite the enormous weight of what acting meant. But what Carlisle gave Edward was immortality and philosophy, a framework, a set of principles for understanding what he was and how to exist inside that understanding with something approaching dignity. These were genuine and essential gifts, and Edward's entire moral architecture for the next century rests on them. What Esme gave him was something different, and something prior, in the sense that it had to come first before the philosophy could take root in anything. She gave him a room, not an allocated space. A room, thought about, arranged with attention to who he specifically was and what he specifically needed, furnished with a piano placed where the acoustics rewarded playing, and positioned near a window that looked out onto landscape worth looking at. She gave him a place inside the house that bore the marks of having been considered, that communicated in the specific and concrete language that domestic care speaks when it is genuine, that his presence in the home was not incidental to the home but part of what the home was for, that he was not living in Carlisle's space by tolerance. He was living in a home that had been built to include him. When Edward returned from his years of hunting humans, when he appeared at Carlisle's door in the 1930s, 5 years of darkness behind him, carrying guilt dense enough to have weight. It was Carlisle who listened without judgment and held him while he wept and offered the philosophical framework that made another attempt at a better life seem possible. But it was Esme's house he returned to, and she had kept his room exactly as he left it. This detail, small enough that the saga does not pause to highlight it, is the detail the theory finds most telling. Not as a museum, not as a reproach, not as a monument to the person he had been before he left and the person she wished he had remained. Simply as a room that was waiting, because the person it belonged to might need it, and she had decided, without drama or announcement or any requirement of acknowledgement, that she would keep it ready for as long as it took. This is what a restoration looks like when the material is a person rather than a building. You do not tear out the damaged section and replace it with something cleaner. You do not require the structure to be in better condition before you keep it. You shore it up from beneath. You keep the original bones intact through whatever the building has to endure, and you make it clear that the damage has not changed your assessment of the original worth, and you trust, patiently and without a deadline, that the structure will find its own way back toward what it was built to be. Rosalie is the hardest case, and the theory earns its full weight here, because Rosalie is the restoration that would break most philosophies of unconditional welcome, and that does not break Esme's, the case that tests the method most severely and demonstrates, through that severity, what the method is actually made of. Rosalie Lillian Hale arrived in the Cullen family, broken in a way that went beyond grief and beyond trauma, into something that does not have a clean name in any language, because it is too specific and too total for clean naming. She had been violated and murdered by men who had treated her as a beautiful object, something to be owned and displayed and used and discarded when the using was finished, and she had been transformed into immortality without genuine consent, in the dark and the pain of her dying moments, by a man who believed he was saving her, and who was in his way right, and who was also taking from her the last meaningful choice her human life contained. She woke into vampirism furious at Carlisle for the transformation, furious at Edward for existing as evidence of what Carlisle had already been willing to do for another before her, furious at the shape of her immortal life, which was extraordinary in almost every measurable way, and which she experienced as a kind of magnificent imprisonment, because the life she had wanted, the ordinary, human, beautiful, specific life with children and seasons and the particular texture of growing older alongside someone you chose, was gone. And this one, however extraordinary, would never be that one. Her resentment was not occasional. It was not a phase she was moving through toward acceptance. It was structural, woven into the way she occupied rooms, the way she understood her own position in the story she had been placed inside without her full agreement. It informed her relationship with every family member in different ways and to different degrees. She was not trying to be difficult. She was simply, completely, and with total honesty, devastated, and devastation expressed through the only register available to her, which was a cold and spectacular fury that most people in her vicinity found either exhausting or intimidating or both. Any coven built on reasonable principles of mutual benefit and social function would have found Rosalie impossible to absorb over the long term. The calculation does not favor it. The disruption to group cohesion that her sustained resentment represents should, by any reasonable social arithmetic, have made coexistence unsustainable. Esme did not find her impossible. Esme walked into Rosalie's damage the way she walked into damaged buildings, looking past what was broken to what was there before the breaking, identifying the original bones, assessing what survived and what it revealed about what the structure had originally been worth. And what she found in Rosalie, beneath the fury and the resentment and the cold, spectacular beauty that Rosalie used as armor, the way other people use walls, was something extraordinary. The girl who had wanted children with a fierceness that the saga treats as the most defining quality of her character across all 5 books. The woman who would carry a dying stranger 100 miles through mountain wilderness because she could not let something that reminded her of tenderness be permitted to die. The person who, underneath every layer of armor, was still capable of love so fierce and so protective that it expressed itself as devotion, as ferocity, as the willingness to do whatever was necessary for the people she had claimed. Esme found this person. She loved her, not the version of Rosalie that Rosalie was able to show on good days, but the complete version, including the fury and the grief and the sustained difficulty. She gave her a room filled with beautiful things, because Rosalie's love of beauty is genuine and deep and one of the most honest things about her, and filling a space with what someone loves is a way of saying, I see what you love, and I think it matters, and I want you to have it. She asked nothing in return. She set no timeline for recovery. She established no conditions for continued belonging. She made it clear, through the slow accumulation of consistent and unannounced action across decades, that Rosalie's place in the family was not contingent on Rosalie's behavior on any given day, or in any given year, or across any given decade. She was in the family. She was loved. The rest was between Rosalie and time. This is what restoration patience looks like at its most demanding. You do not hurry a building that has been severely damaged. You do not set a deadline for structural recovery. You work from the inside, steadily, trusting the process. And you do not withdraw the investment when the progress is slower than you hoped, or when the damage turns out to be deeper than the initial survey suggested. Jasper is the most dangerous restoration, and the one that makes clearest how much genuine courage Esme's method requires, because accepting Jasper was not a soft thing made to look like courage. It was courage, actual and informed and undertaken with full knowledge of the risk. Jasper Whitlock Hale arrived with Alice, and his history was not complicated in the way that interesting histories are complicated. It was dark, He had spent decades in the service of a vampire named Maria, creating newborn armies in the American South and managing their violence and disposing of them when their usefulness ended, which was always because newborns who survived long enough to become stable were newborns who had become strong enough to be threats. He had fed freely on human blood for over a century. His control was the most uncertain in the family by a significant margin. His guilt the most crushing. His potential for serious failure the most real and the most ongoing. He was not a risk that could be managed through careful scheduling or thoughtful seating arrangements. He was a risk that had to be lived with daily, with the understanding that the living with might at any point go very badly wrong. Esme accepted him without qualification or condition. And the theory is careful here because it would be easy to read this acceptance as naivety, as Esme simply not understanding what she was agreeing to, and the theory firmly refuses that reading. She understood. She was not operating from ignorance of Jasper's history or from an optimistic underestimation of what his instability actually meant. She understood exactly what she was accepting, and she accepted it anyway, because she understood something about recovery that the strategic risk assessment cannot account for and cannot measure. You cannot restore a structure you are unwilling to enter. You cannot do the work from the outside. The restoration requires proximity, requires going inside the damage, working from within it, getting close enough to the broken places to understand how they broke and what the breaking revealed about the original structure underneath. Managed distance is not restoration. It is assessment. An assessment, however accurate and however well-intentioned, does not make anything whole. Esme went inside. She has always, in every case, gone inside. What this gave Jasper was something that cannot be manufactured through strategic acceptance or principled tolerance. It gave him unconditional presence. The experience of being loved not past his failures, but including them. Of being inside a family whose love for him was not contingent on his success rate, not held in reserve pending improvement, not expressed as confidence that he would get better while quietly depending on the getting better before the full warmth was extended. He was loved now, in his current condition, with his current history, and that experience, the experience of being loved before you get better, of belonging before you have earned belonging, is, the theory argues, the thing that makes getting better possible. Because you can only work toward a version of yourself worth becoming if you have encountered someone who has decided you are worth becoming it for. Emmett is the simplest case, and the theory handles him carefully because of it, because the simplicity is itself significant. Emmett McCarty Cullen did not arrive broken in the way the others arrived broken. He was dying, mauled by a bear in the mountains of Tennessee, his body destroyed in the particular catastrophic way that bear attacks destroy bodies. And Rosalie found him and was moved by something in his face that reminded her of a boy she had once loved, and she carried him to Carlisle and asked, in the way that only Rosalie would think to ask, whether Emmett wanted to live. He said yes. He woke into vampirism with his essential character intact and uncontested. Joyful, physical, warm, inclined to find everything funnier than strict accuracy required. He did not need the specific patient structural rehabilitation that Rosalie and Jasper and Edward each demanded in their different ways. He was not a hard restoration. He was a relatively straightforward one. But the theory's subtler claim about Emmett is worth slowing down for, because it reveals something important about what Esme built that goes beyond the individual cases. Emmett's brightness is downstream of the environment Esme created. His particular and genuine joy is possible inside this family, because this family has room for joy, because the structure Esme built has space for lightness and humor and the ease that comes from being completely accepted, because she created conditions in which someone could simply be happy without that happiness reading as failure to understand the seriousness of their situation, or as inadequate engagement with the genuine difficulty of the life they are living. Place Emmett in a different coven, one built on hierarchy and the management of power, and the kind of gravity that comes from immortals who take themselves with complete seriousness, and his brightness would have been flattened within decades. Esme built the family in which Emmett could be Emmett, and Emmett's uncomplicated joy became one of the family's most essential resources, the thing that made the harder days livable, the evidence that the life they were building was actually worth building. Draw the full shape of the theory now, with all the evidence assembled and the pattern complete. Esme is not a passive presence in the Cullen family. She is its primary architect in a more literal and more consequential sense than her professional work alone would suggest, and the relationship between her professional work and her family work is not metaphorical in the loose sense. It is the same work, expressed in different materials, driven by the same method, guided by the same philosophy. Every house she restores is a version of the same argument she is making everywhere else in her life. Every patient assessment of a damaged structure, every decision to work from the surviving bones rather than demolishing and replacing, every room returned to beauty and function through steady, sustained care. All of it is Esme articulating in the language of her professional practice the conviction that holds her family together. Broken things do not have to stay broken. Damaged structures, given care and time, and someone who believes in what they were built to be before the damage began, can become more beautiful than they were before the damage. Not in spite of the restoration, but because of it. Because the care taken to restore them is itself a form of love made visible in the material. She knows what it means to be the building. She was the building once at the bottom of a cliff in Ashland, Wisconsin in 1921, assessed by everyone who saw her as beyond the investment of further hope. And someone went inside the damage and found the bones worth saving and decided, without requiring her permission or her gratitude or any indication that the investment would be returned, to build something around them. She has spent a century making sure that no one in her family ever has to be the building alone. There is a particular kind of danger that announces itself, and there is a particular kind that does not. The first kind is useful in its way. It allows the people around it to make informed decisions, to assess the threat, to calibrate their response with some reasonable relationship to the actual risk they are facing. The second kind is something else entirely. The second kind walks into a room and the room feels warmer, and the people inside it relax in ways they would not relax if they understood what they were relaxing around. And by the time any reassessment becomes necessary, it is generally far too late for reassessment to be useful. The second kind does not announce itself because it does not need to. It has already done what it came to do. The fan theory about Esme Cullen as the most lethal hunter in the Cullen family begins here with this distinction, and it asks the listener to hold it carefully before moving to the evidence, because the evidence is not dramatic. It does not consist of a series of documented confrontations or recorded feats of predatory athleticism, or moments where Esme's hunting capability is explicitly displayed for the narrative to comment on. It is quieter than that. It is almost entirely composed of absences, of things the saga does not record, of observations that are never made, of the particular information that lives in what a story chooses not to say. And quieter, in this context, is precisely the point. When fans of the Twilight saga picture the most physically dangerous Cullen in a purely predatory context, the imagination goes immediately and almost universally to Emmett McCarthy Cullen, who fights bears recreationally and finds the experience genuinely enjoyable rather than merely adequate, who approaches physical confrontation with the particular wholehearted joy of someone for whom the contest itself is the reward, rather than simply the means to an end. His massive frame makes him the most visibly formidable presence in any room he enters. His strength is the most immediately legible form of danger the family contains. The assessment is not wrong. Emmett is genuinely and spectacularly dangerous, and no reasonable person would want to be on the receiving end of what he is capable of. The theory does not dispute Emmett's dangerousness. It asks a different question. Not who looks most dangerous, but who is most effective. Not who generates the most visible threat, but who converts that threat most reliably into outcome. It asks you to separate the spectacle of danger from the function of it, to examine what the family's actual predatory record and predatory habits suggest about where the real efficiency lives when the drama is removed and only the results remain. And then it asks you to look at Esme quietly, without rushing the looking. Establish the baseline first, because the baseline is where the argument is most firmly grounded in what the canon actually provides, rather than what the theory constructs around it. Esme Cullen has been a vampire since 1921. By the time the Twilight saga opens in 2005, she's been hunting for 84 years, not occasionally, not during sanctioned family hunting trips as a social event, continuously, regularly, as the ongoing biological necessity of a vampire body that requires sustenance to maintain the physical and emotional stability that the Cullen way of life demands. She has survived, she has thrived, she has maintained her physical condition, her emotional equilibrium, and her family's security across more than 8 decades of the specific and ongoing challenge that the Cullen dietary philosophy represents. The challenge of sustaining vampire physiology on animal blood, when vampire physiology was designed with considerable evolutionary thoroughness for something richer and more immediately satisfying and considerably more available. She has done this without a single documented lapse across 84 years of continuous practice, across the full range of environmental conditions and social pressures and emotional difficulties that the family has navigated together. There is no recorded moment where Esme's dietary control failed in the direction of human prey. This is a more significant achievement than the saga pauses to acknowledge, because the Cullen dietary philosophy is genuinely difficult to maintain, and the canon is honest about that difficulty in the cases of other family members. Edward's control is described as a constant and ongoing effort. Jasper's is documented as the family's most precarious. Even Carlyle, who's been practicing for 3 centuries and has developed a resistance to blood scent that the others openly admire, is not described as someone for whom the challenge has simply ceased to exist. Esme's control is never described at all. It is not remarked on as a struggle or as an achievement. It simply exists, undramatized, in the background of everything else. And the theory finds this absence significant rather than dismissible, because the saga is not shy about documenting difficulty where difficulty exists. And the absence of documented difficulty in Esme's case suggests either that her control is so complete it does not generate narratable tension, or that no one has thought to look at it carefully enough to notice what it represents. The theory opts for the former explanation and builds from there. Now apply the framework that makes the theory genuinely interesting rather than merely counterintuitive, because the counterintuitive reading needs a foundation before it can support weight. Edward hunts with an informational surplus that most predators, human or animal or vampire, could not imagine having access to. He hears his prey before he locates it visually, can receive something functionally analogous to the animal's immediate mental state, its fear responses, its arousal levels, the specific quality of its attention to its environment. That gives him a continuous and updating picture of what the animal is likely to do before it does it. His telepathy does not operate on animals in the full linguistic and conceptual register. It operates on humans, but it provides him with a sensitivity to animal consciousness that translates into predictive accuracy far beyond what observation and experience alone could generate. He is a genuinely excellent hunter. He is also a hunter who has never had to develop the specific skills that the absence of his gift would have required. Alice's precognition gives her access to immediate future outcomes with a clarity and specificity that makes hunting function less as a physical challenge than as a navigational one on the days her visions are operating well. She knows where the animal will be. She knows which direction it will choose at the fork in the trail, which side of the meadow it will move toward, what the sequence of its movements will look like across the next several minutes. Her role in a hunt is primarily one of positioning, getting herself to the place her vision identifies as correct at the time her vision specifies, and trusting the precision of what she has seen to make the physical execution almost secondary. She is effective in the way that someone with a detailed map of terrain they have never visited is effective. The knowledge does not replace the ability to walk, but it transforms the nature of the challenge entirely. Jasper's gift in the context of hunting is the one the theory finds most instructive to examine, because it is the one least explicitly discussed in the saga, and therefore the one that requires the most careful inference. Jasper can alter the emotional states of the creatures around him. In human contexts, this is documented extensively. His ability to send calm or agitation, or a carefully calibrated emotional atmosphere through a room full of people, is one of the saga's most regularly deployed plot elements. In the hunting context, the implication follows naturally from the mechanism. An animal whose fear response has been suppressed, whose flight instinct has been quieted by the specific quality of emotional influence Jasper can project, is an animal that does not run at the speed and in the direction that makes pursuit costly and outcome uncertain. He does not need to be faster than the animal if the animal has been rendered insufficiently afraid to use its full speed. The gift does not make him infallible, but it changes the fundamental terms of the hunt in his favor in ways that no amount of technical skill could replicate. The theory's point is not that these gifts make their possessors lazy or unskilled. It is more precise than that and more interesting. Every gift-assisted hunter in the family has developed a real and genuine skill, tested across decades of continuous practice. But their skill has developed in the context of having assistance, in the context of always having available to them an advantage that compensates for gaps in technique, that rescues situations where pure skill would have fallen short, that makes the development of certain specific technical capacities less urgent because something else is already handling that dimension of the problem. The skill is real. The skill is also not the whole story, and the hunters who have the gifts know it, even if they do not consciously articulate it. Esme's skill is the whole story. Whatever she has learned across 84 years of hunting, she learned without supplementation. Every gap in technique had to be closed by technique. Every situation where a gift would have compensated for a failure had to be resolved by not failing, by having developed the specific capacity that prevented the failure rather than having something else absorb the consequences of it. She hunted, and she learned, and she adjusted, and she hunted again. And across 84 years of that cycle, she developed a technical proficiency that is precisely as complete as it needs to be, because incompleteness, for Esme, was never absorbed by something else. The things we learn without assistance are always, in the end, the things we know most completely. Explore the crossbow head cannon with the full attention it deserves, because this is the most developed and most carefully constructed piece of Esme hunting fan theory, and the care that went into constructing it is part of what makes it compelling. The head cannon holds that Esme hunts with a crossbow, not because she requires an external tool to subdue prey. Vampire physiology, particularly after 84 years of development and maintenance, does not require external assistance to bring down any animal available in the environments the Cullens have inhabited across their decades of movement through North America. She could hunt without equipment, as the others hunt, relying on her physical capabilities and whatever advantages her accumulated skill provides. She chooses the crossbow because the crossbow is not a capability supplement. It is a philosophical expression. A crossbow is a precision instrument that rewards patience above every other quality it rewards. You cannot use a crossbow effectively as a pursuit weapon. The physics of the bolt, the mechanics of the reload, the relationship between the shooter's stability and the accuracy of the shot. All of these factors combine to make the crossbow fundamentally incompatible with the kind of dynamic, high-movement hunting that Emmett or Edward might employ. It is not built for the chase, it is built for the wait. So Esme does not chase. She scouts the terrain before the hunt begins, identifying the positions that offer the best combination of concealment, sideline and relationship to the animal's likely movement patterns. She reads the wind, direction, strength, consistency, and accounts for it in her positioning rather than managing it reactively in the moment. She studies the specific behavioral patterns of whatever species she is hunting, not in a general sense, but in the particular sense of the individual animal. the specific creature whose habits she's been tracking long enough to understand with the specificity that general knowledge cannot provide. She identifies the natural corridor, the path of least resistance through the terrain, the direction the animal will move when the conditions are exactly what they are going to be at the time Esme has chosen for the hunt. And then she settles into her position and she becomes part of the landscape. This is the phrase the fan theory reaches for most consistently. And it is the right phrase, because what Esme achieves in her hunting position is not merely concealment, but something more complete. Concealment implies a presence that has been hidden. What Esme achieves is the absence of perceived presence, the complete integration of herself into the environmental background that the animal is reading, so that her signature, whatever the animal is capable of detecting of her, is received as part of the context, rather than as an element that does not belong. She is still enough, and has been still long enough, that the environment has absorbed her. The animal approaches not because it has been fooled by an inadequate concealment, but because there is nothing in the environment's current reading that suggests it should not approach. And then, when the animal is at the position she identified before she settled into hers, not approximately there, not close enough, but precisely there, at the exact point that makes the shot a certainty rather than a probability, she acts, once, with a decisiveness that the entire preceding patience was constructed to make possible and to make complete. Now consider how completely this method maps onto what the canon has already told us about who Esme is, because the mapping is not a projection. The crossbow headcanon is a reading of documented character, translated into the specific context of hunting. The canon has been describing Esme's hunting method all along. In every other context it has shown her operating in. She is the most still Cullen in the canon's documented scenes, the most patient, the one who observes longest before drawing any conclusion, who gathers the most information before committing to an action, who when she acts does so with a quietness and a completeness that suggests the action is the endpoint of a long and careful invisible process rather than a response to immediate conditions. She does not improvise. She prepares, she positions, she waits. She acts when the moment is precisely right. The crossbow is not a random attribution. It is the logical hunting expression of a character the canon has been fully documenting for 5 books. Develop the predator as host parallel now, because this dimension of the theory is the most philosophically interesting and the most carefully developed in the fan community, and it rewards slow examination. The most effective predators in the natural world are very frequently not the most visibly powerful. Power is one strategy, presentation is another, and in many ecological contexts it is the more reliable one. The anglerfish creates its own light in the absolute darkness of the deep ocean floor, offering warmth and visibility. The things that small creatures in total darkness most desperately want. And the offering is genuine in the sense that the light is real light, visible light, functionally useful light. What it doesn't advertise is what the light is attached to. The orchid mantis has evolved a physical form so precisely calibrated to the appearance of a flower that the insects it preys on approach it with the specific behavioral pattern they use to approach flowers. Without fear, without flight readiness, oriented entirely toward the resource the appearance suggests, the trapdoor spider creates an environment a door flush with the surrounding terrain that the prey reads as ground. The prey does not know it is making a choice. It walks across what appears to be the landscape, and the landscape opens. These predators share a common method. They do not pursue. They create conditions. They present an environment, or an appearance, or an experience that makes the prey comfortable enough to approach voluntarily, that suppresses the fear response by giving it nothing to attach to, that uses the prey's own comfort and the prey's own trust as the mechanism of the hunt. And the theory asks, with the careful gentleness that characterizes its best formulations, whether Esme's domestic warmth functions in an analogous way, not deliberately, not as a strategy she has constructed through conscious predatory calculation. Her warmth is real. Her welcome is genuine. The love she extends to everyone who crosses the threshold of whatever house she's made into a home is as complete and unconditional as the earlier acts of this script have demonstrated at length. There is no performance in it, no calculation, no gap between the warmth she shows and the warmth she feels. The theory is not suggesting that Esme's love is a hunting technique. It is suggesting something more interesting and more subtle than that. It is suggesting that the skills required to make every person who enters your home feel immediately and completely safe, to suppress the stranger's natural wariness, to present an environment so thoroughly welcoming that the human instinct for threat assessment simply finds nothing to report and stands down. These skills are not separate from predatory skill. They are a highly developed expression of it. The ability to read what another creature needs in order to feel safe, and then to provide exactly that thing, is the foundational skill of the kind of predator that does not chase. It is also, as the canon documents extensively, the foundational skill of Esme's domestic and emotional practice. Bella Swan's survival instincts are, as Edward observes multiple times throughout the saga, deeply and almost comically unreliable. She consistently fails to register the danger of situations that should register as dangerous. Edward finds this both alarming and somewhat amusing. The specific failure of her threat detection apparatus to perform its most basic function in her most threat-saturated environment. The Cullen house, full of vampires, should feel dangerous to a human with functional instincts. It does not feel dangerous. It feels to Bella and to the handful of other humans who enter it across the course of the saga like exactly what Esme has constructed it to be. A home, safe, warm, the kind of place you want to stay. Esme made it feel that way. Her presence is the reason the threat detection apparatus has nothing to report, and the predator who has neutralized the prey's threat detection response without the prey's awareness has achieved something that speed and strength and even telepathy cannot reliably replicate. Return to Jasper's role as the family's involuntary emotional recorder, because this is where the theory finds its most precise piece of indirect evidence and where the argument arrives at its quietest and most compelling point. Jasper receives the emotional states of everyone around him as continuous involuntary data. He cannot filter it, cannot choose what he receives, cannot turn the sensitivity down on days when it is more burden than asset. He is always reading the room, always processing the emotional signatures of every person in his vicinity, always aware of the specific quality and intensity and direction of what everyone around him is feeling. And because his awareness is continuous and involuntary, His observations constitute a reliable and unedited record of the family's actual emotional states across a wide range of situations. He comments on these states regularly throughout the saga. Edward's barely contained fury during confrontations. Emmett's uncomplicated excitement before a physical challenge. Rosalie's cold, controlled, deliberate precision when she has decided how a situation will go. Alice's particular quality of focused internal attention when she is navigating a vision. He names these states, attributes them, works with them as a practitioner, works with the materials of their craft. He never names Esme's hunting state. There is no recorded observation across the entire canon of Jasper noting that Esme is experiencing anything distinctive in the approach to or execution of a hunt. Not anticipation, not the specific edge of focused predatory attention, not the particular quality of controlled aggression that hunting requires even from the most disciplined vampire. Nothing. The state she is in when she hunts is, to Jasper's continuously monitoring gift, unremarkable, indistinguishable from her ordinary state, calm, settled, present. The predator who does not feel like a predator, even to the family member whose gift makes him the most reliable emotional witness available, is the most controlled predator in the family, and the most controlled is, across 84 years of continuous practice, in the specific and demanding conditions of the Cullen dietary philosophy, the most complete. The baseball clearing in Twilight, James and Laurent and Victoria emerging from the tree line, the Cullen family forming its defensive configuration with the practiced efficiency of people who have considered this kind of encounter in advance and know exactly where each of them belongs. Edward in front of Bella, Emmett and Jasper taking their flanking positions, the former radiating barely contained physical readiness, the latter moving with the deliberate tactical precision of someone whose military training is the most genuine and most tested in the family. Carlyle at the front, absorbing the diplomatic role with the ease of 3 centuries of practice and making extraordinary situations feel manageable. Alice close enough to be useful, her visions flickering through the immediate future with the rapid updating that genuine uncertainty produces in her sight. And Esme in the formation. Quiet, still, already positioned, the theory notes, in relationship to the angles that would matter if the diplomacy failed and the encounter moved past words into something that words could no longer manage, not generating visible tension, not broadcasting the quality of barely contained readiness that James, as an experienced and highly skilled predator himself, would immediately identify and account for in his assessment of what the Cullen formation represented as a threat. She is the one he probably did not fully account for. She is the one who had chosen her position before the confrontation was visible, who had read the geometry of the clearing and identified where she needed to be if the situation developed in the directions it might develop, who was already where she needed to be before anyone else had finished processing that they needed to be anywhere at all. The quietest Cullen in a confrontation is not the one who is least dangerous. She is the one who chose her position before the moment arrived. The one who has spent 84 years learning that the hunt is decided before it begins, by patience and positioning and the willingness to wait for the precisely right moment, and that everything else, the speed, the strength, the drama of the engagement itself, is simply what happens after the real work is already done. There is a question that the Twilight Saga never thinks to ask about Esme Cullen, and it is a question that becomes more interesting the longer you sit with it and resist the urge to answer it too quickly. A vampire has no physical needs beyond the periodic necessity of feeding. Esme does not sleep. She does not eat. She does not experience the fatigue that governs the rhythm of human days, does not feel the accumulated weight of sustained effort that eventually tells even the most energetic human body that it is time to stop, to rest, to allow the system to recover before continuing. She is not cold, she is not uncomfortable. She is not restless in any physical sense that requires management or relief through action. She could, in theory, sit in one of the beautiful rooms she has furnished with such meticulous and loving attention and simply exist, perfectly still, perfectly present, perfectly at peace in the way that only a being completely liberated from biological urgency can be at peace. For decades at a stretch, with no compulsion from her body or her circumstances or the demands of survival to do otherwise. She cannot stop making things. This is the observation the fan theory begins from, and it deserves to be held for a moment before the explanatory framework arrives, because the observation itself is the evidence, and the evidence is more consistent and more pervasive than a casual reading of the saga suggests. Every few years, the Cullens moved to a new residence. The relocation is a practical necessity, a response to the security risk of human neighbors who are beginning to notice that the family does not age in the way that families are supposed to age. For most of the family, the move is a logistical event. Things to be packed, a new location to be researched, cover stories to be updated and refined. For Esme, the move is not an ending, but a beginning. The moment a new property comes into view, the moment she first walks through rooms that are damaged or neglected, or simply not yet what they could be, something in her attention that the other family members have learned to recognize. A particular quality of focused engagement, a brightness that is distinct from her ordinary warmth, snaps into alignment with a new set of problems. Before the previous house has fully receded from her attention, the new one has already begun to take shape in her mind. Before the structural restoration is complete, she has started thinking about the garden, its relationship to the light at different times of year, the specific plants that would have been indigenous to this region in the period when the house was built, the way a formal garden design might honor the architecture while creating something that feels genuinely lived in, rather than merely historically accurate. Before the garden design is resolved, she has developed an intense new interest in some artistic medium she has not previously explored. The specific technical challenges of Japanese joinery, perhaps, which uses no nails and no glue, and requires a precision in the cutting of wood that cannot be achieved by anything other than patient, exacting, repetitive practice. Or the restoration of antique lead light windows, whose individual pieces of colored glass were made using processes that no longer exist commercially and must be sourced individually from the dwindling supply of salvage historical material. Or the recreation of historically accurate interior plasterwork using lime mortars and traditional application techniques that take months to learn and produce, when done correctly, surfaces of extraordinary beauty. The interest arrives fully formed and consuming. It is not a passing curiosity that she explores at the edges of her attention, while continuing to focus primarily on the main project. It is total. It becomes the thing she is doing, the problem that has her full engagement, the question she's working toward answering. She reads everything available on the subject. She acquires tools and materials with the particular enthusiasm of someone who has decided that having exactly the right equipment is part of the respect owed to the problem. She experiments, fails, adjusts, experiments again, with the complete patience of someone who has unlimited time, and the complete impatience of someone whose mind needs the next piece of the problem as soon as the current piece has been adequately understood. And then, at a point that is genuinely difficult to predict in advance, and that the family has collectively learned not to try to predict, it shifts. The previous project sits somewhere between 80 and 95% complete, finished enough that anyone looking at it would see a finished thing, not finished enough that Esme could honestly say it is done. The new interest has already arrived and already taken hold. The crossover period, when both things are technically in progress, is brief. The restlessness moves on, and it takes her full attention with it, and the previous project enters a state of suspended completion that may last weeks or decades, depending on whether something eventually brings her back to it, or whether the next relocation intervenes first. The ADHD theory begins with this pattern, and it asks a question that the fan community has found genuinely illuminating in a way that opens rather than closes. What if this is not eccentricity? What if this is not simply the behavior of an immortal woman who has so much time available that she can afford to engage with interest incompletely, who has been free by eternity from the social and practical pressure to finish things that a finite human lifespan imposes? What if this pattern, the hyperfocus, the cycling, the simultaneous presence of extraordinary capability and perpetually unfinished work, the immediate and total absorption in whatever is most interesting right now, is a specific and consistent neurological signature that Esme carried into her transformation from her human life, and that her transformation, by eliminating every biological mechanism that previously imposed natural limits on it, has amplified into the relentless and magnificent and occasionally chaotic creative energy that characterizes her immortal existence. Establish the framework carefully, because it deserves care, and because the theory is doing something specific that is worth naming. This is not pathologizing. It is not reducing Esme to a clinical label, or offering the label as a complete account of who she is. It is doing the opposite of reducing. It is providing a framework that makes the observable patterns of her behavior cohere in a way that the alternative readings, eccentricity, abundance of time, the particular quirks of an immortal domestic artist, do not quite manage. It is giving texture and specificity and genuine interior depth to a character who has been treated as primarily atmospheric, who has been rendered as warmth and presence, rather than as a person with a specific and interesting and entirely her own way of moving through the world. The traits the theory draws on are observable across the canon without requiring interpretive strain. The pattern switching between intense projects, moving from full absorption in one thing to full absorption in another without a conventional transitional period of diminishing engagement. The simultaneous presence of extraordinary capability. The houses she restores are genuinely beautiful. The work is genuinely skilled. The results are genuinely remarkable. And perpetually unfinished work, because the completion is not the point, and the mind knows this even when social convention suggests it should be. the particular quality of her attention when it is fully engaged, which is a quality of complete and unreserved absorption that the other family members describe and respond to with a mixture of admiration and mild, careful awareness. The way she moves immediately and totally to whoever in the family needs her most, because a person in distress is the most compelling available problem, and the most compelling available problem always gets everything she has. In 1895, the year Esme was born, no clinical framework existed for what we now understand as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. The observational literature was not assembled. The neuroscience was not available in any form that would have made the pattern recognizable as a pattern rather than as a collection of individual traits that might or might not seem related depending on who was doing the observing and what framework they were bringing to it. A girl with a restless, hyper-focusing, pattern-switching mind in rural Ohio at the turn of the 20th century would not have been assessed or supported or given language for the specific experience of her own cognition. She would simply have been herself, energetic and creative and enthusiastic and capable of extraordinary absorbed effort on the things that genuinely captured her, and genuinely unable to produce equivalent engagement on the things that did not, and moving through the world with a quality of aliveness that some people found magnetic and others found exhausting, often simultaneously. She would have been managed, channeled. The domestic structure that her era prescribed for women of her class provided a partial accommodation for some of these traits, because domestic management of a household of any complexity is genuinely multivariate work that rewards the kind of broad environmental awareness and flexible task switching that characterizes attentional patterns like Esme's. She would have been good at it in the way that people with restless pattern switching cognition are often unexpectedly effective at complex management, not because the individual tasks absorb them, but because the system as a whole is interesting, and the system is always changing, and a changing system with multiple simultaneous variables is far more engaging to this kind of mind than a stable, predictable, linear one. But the accommodation was imperfect, because it always is. The projects that got most of the way to completion and then lost her attention when only the uninteresting finishing remained. The new interest that arrived without warning and consumed her entirely before the previous one was done. The particular quality of being most completely herself when she was in the middle of something genuinely difficult and most visibly restless when nothing sufficiently difficult was immediately available. These things would have shown, and the people around her would have managed them with varying degrees of grace, and Esme would have understood herself as someone who worked differently without having any framework for why. Now consider what transformation did to these traits, and follow the logic with the specificity it deserves, because this is where the theory makes its most interesting and most concrete claim. Vampire physiology eliminates fatigue, not reduces it, not provides a longer runway before it arrives, not makes recovery faster, eliminates it entirely, completely, as a biological fact, as a regulatory mechanism, as the system by which the body enforces limits on what the mind is permitted to sustain without interruption. In a human being, the brain's management of attention operates in part through a complex and continuous series of fatigue signals. The flagging of sustained focus after a certain duration of uninterrupted effort, the the physical restlessness that accumulates during periods of fixed attention and signals with increasing urgency, a need to shift. The appetite and thirst cues that interrupt even the most consuming hyperfocus and insist on the body's requirements regardless of the mind's current priorities. The sleep cycle that enforces a complete and non-negotiable reset of attentional resources at regular intervals, regardless of whether the mind feels finished with what it was doing before the reset was imposed. These mechanisms are not purely limiting. They are also protective. They prevent the open-ended hyperfocus that can, in a human being with sufficiently absorbing interests and a sufficiently poor relationship with the body's signals, result in genuine physical harm through extended neglect of basic needs. Esme's transformation removed all of these mechanisms simultaneously and permanently. There is no fatigue signal arriving after 6 hours of restoration work to suggest that she has been at this long enough and should consider stopping. There is no hunger pulling her attention back to her body's requirements. At intervals, the body has decided are non-negotiable. There is no sleep cycle enforcing a nightly reset, whether the current project has reached a sensible stopping point or not. Whatever drove her restless creativity as a human being now runs on an engine that has no governor, no thermal limit, no point at which the system must pause for recovery. The pattern switching is still there, the cycling from one absorbing interest to the next, the movement of full attention from the completed enough to the newly interesting. The hyperfocus is still there, the complete absorption in whatever currently has her, the quality of total engagement that makes everything outside the current problem temporarily invisible. But there is no natural stopping point, no biological voice arriving at intervals to say, enough for now. Just the engine running continuously in a body that will never tell it that it needs to rest. Walk through the specific evidence the fan community has assembled, because this is where the theory moves from framework to documentation, and the documentation rewards careful attention. The houses first, because the houses are the most quantifiable evidence available. The Cullens have occupied a remarkable number of residences across the decades since the family began to form in the early 1920s, and the rate of acquisition and departure exceeds what pure security management would require if security management were the only driver. Properties are left when the security situation is not yet urgent, when the human neighbors have not yet begun asking the questions that require relocation as a response, when from a purely practical standpoint, another several years of occupation would be entirely manageable. They are left, the theory argues, when Esme has finished with them, when the restoration is genuinely complete, when the interesting structural and aesthetic problems have been resolved, and what remains is only maintenance, when there is nothing left in the building that requires the specific quality of engaged creative attention that makes working on it worthwhile. The family moves, in part, because Esme needs a new project, and the family understands this and accommodates it, and does not frame it as an inconvenience, because the family has understood for decades that Esme's need for new problems is not a personal failing, but an expression of who she is. And who she is someone they would not alter for any consideration. The rotating creative interest documented across the saga's extended material are the most direct evidence the theory has available, and the fan community has assembled a catalogue of them that spans a full period of the family's history. Architectural restoration is the constant. the through line that never fully disappears because it is the most reliably interesting, the most consistently generative of new and sufficiently difficult problems. But around it cycle a range of secondary interests with a consistency of pattern that the theory finds unmistakable. Each arrives fully, each absorbs completely. Each recedes not because it has been abandoned, but because it has been understood well enough that the understanding itself resolves the engagement, and something new has become the most interesting available question. The cooking is perhaps the single most revealing individual case, because it is the one the saga documents most directly, and that seems, on its surface, most immediately inexplicable. Esme prepares food that no one in her household will eat. She does this regularly, with genuine and visible engagement, producing elaborate and carefully considered meals for a family that is physically incapable of consuming them with any pleasure. The sensory argument that cooking smells make the house feel more convincingly inhabited, more human, safer for the casual human visitors the family occasionally receives, has partial merit, but does not fully account for the extent and consistency of the practice, for the complexity of what she prepares, for the evident genuine absorption she brings to it, rather than the mechanical production of a sensory effect. The theory's explanation does not reach for elaborate justification. She cooks because cooking is interesting while she is doing it. The chemistry of heat and time applied to proteins and starches and fats, the way multiple simultaneous processes had to be managed in relationship to each other, the way a small adjustment in temperature or timing propagates through the system and changes the final result in ways that require the cook to be continuously reading and responding rather than simply executing a fixed sequence. This is engaging in exactly the way that complex, multivariate, continuously changing systems are engaging to a mind that finds systems interesting. She is not cooking for the result. She is cooking for the problem. The food is the evidence that the problem was solved. The solving was the point. Emmett has reportedly eaten some of it, on at least one documented occasion, out of a combination of genuine curiosity and the particular brand of cheerful willingness to try things that characterizes his approach to almost everything. His assessment, delivered with the diplomatic care for which he is not otherwise known, was that it was very good, and also that he was not going to do that again. Esme was reportedly delighted by the feedback and immediately began planning something more ambitious. This interaction is not in the main canon. It lives in the fan community's collective imagination of the family. But it feels true, which is perhaps the highest standard available for things that are not documented. Develop now the theory's most tender observation, the one that reframes Esme's mothering in a way that adds texture without changing anything already established about its quality or its consequence. When a family member is struggling, when Edward is in the grip of a self-loathing that has become dense enough to be visible to everyone in the family despite his best efforts at management, when Rosalie is having one of the days where the grief for her lost humanity is most acute and has stopped being something she can keep behind the cold, spectacular armor she usually maintains, when Jasper is fighting his instincts with an effort that is costing him more than he will acknowledge to anyone, when Alice has seen something in her visions that she is not yet ready to share, and the weight of the knowing is visible in the way she holds herself. Esme's attention moves to them, not as a secondary consideration to be addressed once the current project has been sufficiently advanced to allow interruption. Immediately, completely, with the full absorption of a hyper-focus that has identified its most compelling currently available problem and has reoriented entirely toward it. The family member in front of her receives everything she has, not a portion of her attention, managed thoughtfully alongside the other demands currently being made on it. Everything. For as long as the everything is needed. The restoration project does not call her back. The garden design does not assert its claims. The lead-light windows wait with the patience of objects that have already waited a very long time and can wait longer. The person in front of her is the only thing that currently exists in Esme's full attention, and they will remain the only thing until the situation resolves, or until she is satisfied that what she can offer has been given as completely as she is capable of giving it. This is the gift side of a mind that does not do anything by halves. The same cognitive pattern that makes her cycle through creative interests and leave houses behind when their most interesting problems have been solved also makes her, in the moments when someone she loves is hurting, the most completely present person available. Not the most present among the Cullens, the most present available anywhere. There is no distraction. There is no divided attention. There is no part of her mind running the background process of the unfinished project, while the foreground process engages with the person in front of her. She is simply moved with the full speed and completeness of a hyper-focus shifting target to the new most important thing. And for as long as it takes, the new most important thing is this person, in this moment, needing this specific quality of attention. And they will have it. Carlyle understood this about Esme earlier and more completely than he has ever explicitly articulated in any documented conversation. The decision to keep finding new properties, to maintain across the decades a consistent supply of sufficiently interesting structural problems, was care expressed in the specific currency that Esme could most use. Not care that required her to acknowledge the need. Not care that drew attention to itself or expected gratitude for its provision. Simply the quiet, ongoing work of understanding what someone needs and making sure it is available, sustained across decades without announcement or expectation of recognition, which is care in its most complete and most generous form. He understood that her restlessness was not a problem requiring management, but a nature requiring accommodation. And he understood that the accommodation was not a burden. It was a privilege, because the same engine that needed new houses also built the family's most consistently beautiful environments and created the family's most completely attentive emotional presence and generated the family's most reliable source of the kind of wholehearted, absorbed, total care that most people spend their entire lives hoping to encounter once and consider themselves fortunate if they do. Close with the image the theory finds most affecting, the one that makes the ADHD reading feel not like a clinical observation applied from the outside, but like a recognition. The specific quiet warmth of finally having a name for something you have always known was there. Esme, in the early decades of her vampire life, before the family had grown to its current size, before the rhythm of acquisition and restoration and movement had been established as the family's pattern, before there were enough people needing her and enough houses requiring her and enough interesting problems available to keep the engine adequately occupied. The restlessness running on its new engine without a governor and without a stopping point and without the biological mechanisms that previously, however imperfectly, had imposed some structure on it. The creative energy with nowhere yet to go at full capacity. The mind built for constant engagement with difficult problems, operating in a body that will never tell it to rest, in a life that has not yet assembled a full structure of projects and people that will eventually give the energy somewhere worthy to go. Carlyle found her a house, and then another after that. He kept finding her the damaged and the abandoned and the structurally interesting, kept identifying the buildings that other people had assessed as beyond worthwhile investment, and that he knew, because he knew Esme, were exactly the kind of problem the engine needed. He did not explain this in those terms. He did not frame it as accommodation of a neurological pattern or management of a specific kind of creative need. He simply kept finding her the thing, quietly and consistently, because he understood her, and understanding someone and quietly giving them what they need without requiring them to ask for it or explain why they need it is perhaps the most complete expression of love that exists. She has never stopped making things. She will never stop. The engine runs without a governor, and the houses become more beautiful, and the family becomes more held, and somewhere in whatever house the Cullens are currently occupying, there is a room that is approximately 87% finished, and a window whose LED light restoration is the most interesting problem currently available, and everything else, for now, can wait. There is a particular kind of love that expresses itself not in grand gestures or dramatic declarations, but in the small, specific, ongoing act of protecting someone's right to keep being exactly who they are, disasters and all. It is the love that moves your fragile things quietly out of the path of the incoming project without mentioning that it did so. The love that conducts a structural assessment of the wall before the conversation about whether the wall needs to come down has even properly begun. The love that has, somewhere in the back of its awareness, a continuously updated inventory of which rooms are currently safe to enter without warning, and which require at minimum a brief reconnaissance before committing to full presence. This is the love the Cullen family has developed for Esme's domestic practice across the decades, and the fan theory that documents it, the accumulated and lovingly maintained catalogue of Esme's household disasters, the 7 houses, the glue gun, the bread, the wall, the incidents that the family has collectively and without formal agreement decided never to raise directly in conversation, is perhaps the warmest thing the Twilight fan community has ever produced. It is comedy, but it is comedy of the specific kind that is made entirely of love, that could only exist between people who know each other well enough and long enough to find the disasters beloved rather than merely tolerable. Before the theory can be properly appreciated, the context needs to be established, because the context is itself extraordinary, and the comedy that lives inside it is only legible once you understand the full dimensions of the absurdity that the Cullen family has voluntarily constructed around itself. Vampires are apex predators. This is not a characterization that requires qualification or softening. It is a straightforward description of what they are in the biological and ecological sense. They are beings of extraordinary physical strength, capable of tearing through materials that would resist any human effort without apparent exertion. Their reflexes operate at speeds that make human reaction times look geological by comparison. They are functionally indestructible by any conventional means. immune to temperature, fatigue, hunger in the ordinary sense, and the accumulated physical damage that limits human bodies in almost every demanding context. They can run faster than vehicles designed for speed. They can hear conversations happening in adjacent buildings. They can smell the particular chemical signature of a specific individual from distances that would seem implausible if the evidence were not so thoroughly documented. And they spend a very significant portion of their immortal existence debating the merits of throw pillow arrangements. The Cullens have made a collective and apparently sincere commitment to the performance of human domesticity at a level of detail and consistency that goes considerably beyond what their actual security requirements would strictly demand. The kitchen in the Cullen house is fully equipped and regularly used, despite the fact that none of its primary occupants eat in any conventional sense. The beds in the bedrooms are made and maintained, despite the fact that the people nominally sleeping in them do not sleep. The living room furniture is arranged for the comfort of bodies that have no particular need to rest, positioned around a fireplace that creates warmth for beings who do not feel cold, in a space that is lit at levels comfortable for human vision, that every person in the room has long since ceased to require. The Cullens are, in the most literal possible sense, method actors in the production of their own humanity, and they take the production with a seriousness that would be impressive if it were not also, from a certain angle, genuinely and completely hilarious. Into this context comes Esme, who takes the production most seriously of all, who is invested more deeply and more consistently in the performance of domestic human life than any other member of the family, and who, according to the fan theory that the community has been building and refining and adding to with obvious affection for as long as the fandom has been old enough to develop a sense of humor about the things it loves, takes it so seriously and pursues it with such complete and unself-conscious absorption that she periodically, accidentally, and with the best possible intentions, takes it slightly too far. The glue gun incident is the cornerstone of the catalogue, the event that the fan community returns to most consistently, and that has accumulated the most elaborate and most lovingly detailed elaboration across the years of the fandom's engagement with it. It begins, as so many of Esme's more consequential projects begin, with a genuine and reasonable creative interest. Upholstery restoration is a natural extension of her architectural work. The same principle of structural rehabilitation applied to furniture rather than buildings. The same philosophy of finding what is valuable in the damaged and making it functional and beautiful again. She researched the field with characteristic thoroughness. She acquired materials and tools with the particular enthusiasm of someone who has decided that having exactly the right equipment is the minimum respect owed to the problem. The glue gun she selected was industrial grade. This detail is significant. The fan theory is careful to note that Esme did not acquire a consumer-grade craft tool of the kind available in general hobby supply stores. She acquired a commercial upholstery adhesive applicator rated for heavy materials, designed for professional workshop use, capable of producing bonds of a permanence and strength that the manufacturers described in their technical documentation as essentially irreversible under normal conditions. Esme read the technical documentation. She found it interesting. She proceeded. The application went well. The antique chair she was working on, a Victorian parlour piece with original horsehair stuffing and a frame of exceptional quality beneath its damaged upholstery, looked, when the work was complete, genuinely magnificent. The fabric she had selected was historically appropriate, the tension was correct, the finishing details were executed with the precision that characterized all of Esme's work when she was fully absorbed in a problem. She was pleased. She moved on to consider the next piece in the set. The discovery occurred approximately 4 hours later, when the adhesive had achieved the full extent of its cure, and the chair's new relationship with the surrounding environment became apparent. The chair had bonded to the floor, not to the surface of the floor in a way that might have been managed with careful leverage and patience, but through the floor covering to the subfloor beneath, through a chemical reaction that the technical documentation had described as a feature rather than a hazard. A section of the antique rug beneath the chair had been incorporated into the bond and was no longer separable from either the chair above it or the floor below it. 3 of Esme's own fingers had become briefly but thoroughly involved in the situation before she had registered what was happening and stopped moving them, which prevented the involvement from becoming structural, but introduced a new dimension of complexity to the problem. Carlyle was called home from the hospital. This required him to explain his early departure to colleagues who had come to rely on his availability with a degree of trust that made unexpected absences feel significant. The explanation he offered was a domestic emergency, which was technically accurate. The colleagues expressed sympathy and assumed the emergency was of a kind they could imagine. It was not. Edward's awareness of the situation preceded Carlyle's arrival by the margin that his telepathic range provided. The family's subsequent and rather firm collective agreement that Edward should under no circumstances describe, either verbatim or in paraphrase, the specific content of his thoughts during the period between receiving the information and achieving sufficient composure to respond to it, helpfully remains, in the fan community's elaboration, one of the more rigorously maintained of the family's unspoken protocols. The chair was eventually freed. The method required several hours, tools not originally intended for this application, and a collaborative problem-solving process that Emmett later described as genuinely one of the more interesting structural challenges he had encountered, which was either generous or sincere, and possibly both. The section of rug was not saved. It was given a burial that the fan community describes as respectful, and Emmett describes as necessary, given that a proper funeral seemed excessive for floor covering, a position on which Esme reserved her opinion. The baking phase occupies a different register in the catalogue. Warmer, more domestic, simultaneously more explicable and more bewildering, with a quality of comedy that comes not from catastrophe, but from the particular absurdity of scale. Esme's interest in bread making arrived with the same totality that characterized all her interests, and it was grounded in a genuinely reasonable principle. The smell of baking bread is one of the most powerfully associative human sensory experiences available. It communicates warmth and inhabitation, and the specific kind of domestic abundance that makes a house feel like a home, rather than a residence, in a way that almost nothing else achieves with comparable efficiency. Esme wanted the house to smell lived in. She wanted visitors, Bella, Charlie, the occasional human whose presence in the family's life required careful management, to walk through the door and receive Immediately, and before any conscious processing had occurred, the sensory message that this was a warm and human and welcoming place inhabited by people who baked bread for each other. This reasoning was sound. The execution was characteristically comprehensive. The first batch was a single loaf. The technique was researched. The result was correct. Esme examined it, found it satisfying, and calculated that the sensory effect she was aiming for could be enhanced by more bread in the same way that a single instrument can be enhanced by an orchestra. The calculation was not wrong exactly. It simply did not include an upper boundary. Jasper, arriving in the kitchen some hours after the project had been underway, found the situation. He stood in the doorway for a moment that the fan community has decided lasted considerably longer than Jasper has ever officially acknowledged, taking in the full inventory of the available surfaces and their current occupants. Every horizontal surface in the kitchen, several surfaces in the adjacent dining room that had been recruited when the kitchen reached capacity, a cooling rack that Esme had constructed from available materials when the conventional cooling infrastructure proved insufficient, 18 loaves by the conservative estimate, possibly 23, depending on which fan is doing the counting, and whether the small experimental batch on the counter by the window is being categorized separately or incorporated into the main total. Jasper's empathic gift, which gives him continuous involuntary access to the emotional states of everyone in his vicinity, reported that Esme was experiencing complete and untroubled satisfaction with the project. This information did not, in the moment, feel as reassuring as it might have in a different context. Esme, he said, with the careful tone of someone choosing their words with the specific precision that a situation requires, "Are we expecting guests?" Esme looked at the bread. She looked at it with the particular quality of attention that arrives when a person comes back to themselves after a period of complete absorption and sees, for the first time, and with some surprise, what the absorption has produced. There was a pause of some duration. "I may have gotten slightly carried away," she said. The bread was distributed. Every church within a reasonable radius, every food bank within a distance that Esme judged appropriate to the quantity available. A neighbor, whose recent difficult circumstances Esme had noted and filed, in the way she filed everything, as something to be addressed when an appropriate vehicle presented itself. The vehicle had arrived somewhat earlier and in somewhat larger quantities than originally planned, but the principle held. The load-bearing wall is perhaps the most structurally consequential entry in the catalogue, and the one that Edward has most consistently declined to discuss in detail, citing an ongoing commitment to family harmony that the other family members receive with varying degrees of credibility. The property was a Victorian house in upstate New York, acquired and begun in the manner of all Esme's restoration projects, with an initial survey that identified the property's original quality and its current damage, and the work required to bring the two into proper relationship. The survey was thorough. Esme had conducted her own structural assessment, which was detailed and accurate, and which correctly identified a number of features of the original construction that less experienced eyes would have missed. The wall between the dining room and the sitting room had not been part of the original design in its current position. Esme had reached this conclusion through careful examination of the original architectural evidence. the way the moldings interrupted rather than flowed, the quality of the materials relative to the surrounding construction, the proportional relationship between the two rooms that the wall disrupted in a way that was at odds with the evident intentions of the original architect. She was correct. The wall had been added later. It was not original. It did not belong there. It was, however, load-bearing. This information had not made itself apparent during the initial assessment, for reasons that structural engineers who were later consulted describe as understandable, given the nature of the subsequent work undertaken. A characterization that the family received with a diplomatic gratitude appropriate to the circumstances. The sound that the ceiling produced upon being invited to express its relationship with the wall below it reached Emmett in the adjacent room with sufficient clarity that he was through the doorway before the first significant piece of plaster had completed its trajectory. He stood in the new, more open space between what had been two rooms and was now one considerably less stable environment, and he looked at Esme, and Esme looked at the ceiling, and the ceiling expressed one or two additional opinions before settling into a position of provisional structural accommodation. The wall was not original, Esme said, which was accurate and which did not, in the moment, feel like the most pressing aspect of the situation. No, said Emmett, surveying the adjusted ceiling with the particular expression he reserved for situations that required him to think carefully before speaking. It really wasn't. The house was saved. Carlyle retained a structural engineer on an ongoing basis after this, described in family communications as a general professional resource, with no specific incident cited as the motivation for the addition. The family's collective response to the catalogue is the warmest element of the theory, and the one that reveals most clearly what the comedy is ultimately made of. Because the response is not frustration, and it is not resignation, and it is not the particular strained patience of people who are managing something they wish were different. It is love, expressed in the specific and practical language of people who have known someone long enough to develop systems. Jasper monitors the kitchen when Esme enters it with any heat-generating equipment, a practice he describes as general household awareness, and that the family has agreed not to examine too closely. Emmett conducts structural assessments of any wall Esme is looking at, with a particular quality of focused attention that precedes a renovation decision, a process that involves him placing his hand at intervals along the surface and nodding with an air of professional confidence that is not entirely supported by his formal qualifications in the field, but that has, on several occasions, successfully identified the question that needed to be asked before the answer became visible in the ceiling. Edward has developed the capacity to identify, from the specific quality of Esme's thought patterns at a range of approximately 4 rooms, when a new project is entering the planning phase, and has learned to share this information with the relevant family members with a timing that allows for reasonable preparation. Alice sees most of it coming, and has a practice of quietly relocating the things she values most to rooms that are not in the current project's anticipated scope, which she executes with a casualness that fools no one, but that everyone maintains the courtesy of not commenting on. None of this is ever discussed directly. There is no family meeting about the systems. There is no protocol document. There is simply the accumulated understanding of people who know someone completely and love her completely, and have organized themselves around the full reality of who she is. Not the version of her that would be easier. Not the version with better completion rates and fewer incidents requiring professional intervention, but the actual Esme, with all her magnificent restlessness and her absolute commitment to the interesting problem, and her occasional and entirely characteristic failure to identify the precise moment when enough is enough, before the ceiling makes the determination for her. They protect her right to keep experimenting. They move their fragile things. They stand by with the particular readiness of people who have learned that the most loving thing they can do is not prevent the disasters, but be present for them, be useful during them, and then never bring them up again afterward in any way that would make Esme feel that the experiment was not worth attempting, because the experiments are worth attempting. Every one of them. The glue gun and the bread and the wall and the 6 other incidents the fan community has catalogued with such obvious affection are not embarrassments. They are evidence. They are proof that Esme is still, after a century of immortality, someone who tries things. Someone who follows an idea to its full extent without installing an automatic stopping point. Someone who brings total commitment to whatever she is doing and accepts the consequences of that totality as the reasonable cost of engaging with the world without a safety margin. A vampire who stops experimenting has, in some essential way, stopped hoping, has decided that the world is fully known, and the interesting questions have been answered, and the reasonable boundary of safe engagement has been established and need not be exceeded. Esme has never made this decision. She will never make it. The engine runs and the ideas arrive, and somewhere in the family's current residence there is a project in progress and a wall that Emmett has quietly checked, and a kitchen that Jasper is keeping one empathic sense directed toward, and all of it is love. All of it has always been love. From the very beginning, in every form it has ever taken, including the forms that required a structural engineer and an industrial solvent, and the quiet relocation of Alice's favorite things to a room on a different floor. Every single bit of it is love, and the family would not have it any other way, and neither would we. Return to the cliff. Not as backstory, not as an origin point to be noted in a character summary and moved past on the way to more immediately dramatic material. Return to it as the center of everything, as the place where all 7 acts of theory and evidence and love and comedy have been pointing. As the fact about Esme Cullen that makes everything else about her make sense, in the way that a keystone makes an arch make sense, not by being the most visible element, but by being the one that holds the pressure of everything on either side. Ashland, Wisconsin, 1921. A cliff above water in the particular cold of a Wisconsin winter that does not apologize for itself, that does not moderate its temperature out of consideration for the people standing in it. A woman 26 years old, which is young enough that most of the life she might have lived is still theoretically ahead of her, and old enough that she has already learned, with a thoroughness that only experience teaches, exactly how much of that theoretical life is available to someone in her specific circumstances. She did not climb the cliff in emptiness. This is the thing the theories have been circling from the beginning, the thing that every act of this script has been, in its own way, trying to say. A person who feels nothing does not climb a cliff. They sit down wherever they are and they wait for time to pass. Because time passing is the only thing available to someone who has exhausted their capacity for feeling. The cliff is an act of extremity. It requires energy. It requires the particular desperate energy of someone whose capacity for feeling has not been exhausted but overwhelmed. Someone who has felt too much for too long, with too little structure available to hold the feeling, and who has run out of ways to contain what they are carrying inside the life they have been given to carry it in. She loved a man, and the love was met with cruelty. She loved a baby, and the love was met with 3 days and then silence. She loved life enough that she kept trying, kept enduring, kept getting up inside circumstances that would have justified stopping long before they finally stopped her. And then she ran out of trying, not because the love ran out, but because the structures available to hold it had all failed, one after another, and she could not find another one. And so she went to the cliff. She did not know what was coming. This is the other fact the theories have been orbiting, the one that makes her choice. When it comes after the fall, after the fire, in the cool, dark room where Carlisle's face is the first thing she sees, the most extraordinary thing about her. She could not have imagined the family she was about to fall into. She had no framework for it, no version of the future she might have constructed. Standing at the cliff's edge in 1921 could have included the reality of what was coming, the century of immortal life, the extraordinary family built from broken strangers, the houses and the projects and the glue gun and the bread and the completely unself-conscious way she would spend 100 years being exactly and entirely herself in a family that would organize itself around the full reality of who she was and call the organization love. She could not have known any of it, and she jumped anyway. And something in her, the love that doesn't run out, the capacity that was always larger than the circumstances available to contain it, survived the fall. Carlisle found her in the morgue because that is where she was, and because he was working at the hospital, and because the particular combination of those two facts produced an encounter that changed the shape of everything that came after it. He stood beside the gurney in the cold of that room and heard the heartbeat that should not have been present, and made the choice that he understood, with the full weight of 3 centuries of careful moral thinking, was the most consequential choice available to him in that moment. He bit her. He introduced the venom. He stepped back and waited through 3 days of fire that she endured in the particular silence that the transformation imposes. The internal burning that has no external voice, the remaking of everything, cellular and permanent, while the outside remains still. And on the 3rd day, she opened new eyes in the cool dark and looked at the face of the man she had carried in memory for 10 years, through everything her human life had subjected her to, and she understood immediately what had happened. What she chose next is the fact the theories keep returning to, in different registers and from different angles, because it is the most extraordinary fact the saga contains about her, and the one that is most consistently passed over in the rush to get to the more visibly dramatic events of the story. She chose, fully, immediately, without the extended period of grief and rage and refusal that the transformation visited on other members of the family in their own ways and at their own paces. She looked at what she had become, and she looked at Carlisle, and she said, There was nothing to forgive, and she meant it. And then she built something extraordinary out of the life she found herself in, not because it was easy, and not because she was simple, and not because she lacked the depth or the intelligence to understand what she had lost. She chose because she understood, with the bone-deep knowledge of someone who has genuinely and completely lost everything that her human life had to offer, what it looks like to waste the time you are given. She had been given more time. She was not going to waste it on refusing to live inside it. Rosalie could not make this choice for decades. The anger at what had been taken from her, the human life, the children, the seasons of an ordinary existence, was too legitimate and too total to be resolved by decision. She raged, and the raging was real. And it took the long, slow work of time and Esme's unconditional presence to bring her to something that was not peace exactly, but was functional enough to live in. Edward spent years in self-loathing so consuming that it sent him away from the family entirely, drove him into the darkness of the vigilante years, and then back again, cycle after cycle, his guilt a wheel he could not stop turning. Jasper's first decades with the Cullens were a continuous and costly battle against a century of differently formed instincts, a battle he lost often enough that the losing became part of the story rather than an interruption of it. Esme chose immediately, and the theories do not offer this as evidence that she had less to grieve or less reason for anger or a simpler relationship with the loss of her humanity. They offer it as evidence of something rarer and more specific. She had already, in her human life, learned the thing that the others were still in the process of learning across their early vampire decades. She had already learned what it cost to refuse love when love is what you have been given. She had already learned, at the bottom of the grief for her baby and inside the years of the marriage and at the edge of the cliff, that the thing you are given is not always the thing you would have chosen, and that what you do with the thing you are given is the only question that ultimately matters. She had been given immortality in Carlisle and the possibility of a family. She was not going to refuse it. She was not going to waste the time at the bottom of a refusal while the life she had been given waited for her to come back to it. Consider what this choice cost her, because the theories are not sentimental, and they are not suggesting that Esme's peace with her transformation was without sacrifice or without depth. She lost her humanity. She lost the seasons of a human life, the particular beauty of aging alongside someone, of watching a child grow, of the body's own clock keeping time in ways that give life its sense of proportion and weight. She lost Renée Dwyer's version of ordinary happiness, which is the version Rosalie mourns most specifically and most visibly, and which is a real and legitimate loss that deserves its full acknowledgement. But Esme had already lost those things before the cliff. The marriage had taken from her the version of a life where love was reciprocal and safe and sustained. The baby had taken from her the version of a future she had been counting on. The family who sent her back had taken from her the version of a childhood home that was also a refuge. She arrived at the cliff already dispossessed of the ordinary human future that Rosalie mourns, and what the transformation gave her was not that future. It could not give her that future, but a different one, larger, stranger, more dangerous in ways that required constant management, and more beautiful in ways that no ordinary human life could have produced. She took it. She took the whole of it, with the clarity of someone who has already been to the bottom and knows that the bottom is survivable and that the other side of surviving is the only direction worth moving in. Now bring the 7 theories together, because they have been building toward this synthesis from the beginning, and the synthesis is the portrait of a woman more extraordinary than the saga paused to draw. Her love was amplified by transformation into something that operates beyond any human scale of fatigue or self-protection. The gift that made all the other gifts possible. The gravity that held the family in orbit around a shared home rather than scattering each of them into their own separate darkness. This is the foundation. Without it, none of the rest of the portrait stands, because a portrait requires a ground to stand on, and Esme's love is the ground. Her restoration work is the same philosophy expressed in a different material. The conviction that damaged things do not have to stay damaged, that the original bones are worth preserving, that the work of rebuilding around what survived is not lesser than the work of building from scratch, but is in fact the harder and the more honest and the more beautiful form of the work. She believes this about buildings because she has lived it as a person, and she brings it to every broken person her family delivers to her door. And the consistent application of that belief across a century of family life is what turned a collection of extraordinary and damaged immortals into something that functions genuinely and durably as a home. Her hunting is efficient and invisible, and conducted with the particular precision of someone who has spent 84 years developing pure technical skill in the absence of any gift to compensate for its gaps. She is the predator who does not announce herself, who positions herself before the moment arrives, who waits for the precisely right instant with the patience of someone who understands that patience and waiting are not the same thing. That patience is active, is a form of readiness, is the most disciplined possible relationship with time. The warmth she extends to everyone who enters her home is real. So is the predator. She contains both fully, without contradiction, because she has always contained more than the single dimension that any one angle of observation can capture. Her restless mind, the hyper-focusing, pattern-switching, endlessly creative energy that her transformation set free from every biological limit, is the engine of everything she has built. The houses are more beautiful because she cannot stop making them. The family is more held because her attention, when it moves to a person in need, moves with the total absorption of a hyper-focus that has found its most important available problem, and will not leave until the problem has been given everything she has. The disasters are more beloved because they are proof that she has never installed a safety margin between herself and the world, that she still tries things completely, that she has never decided the interesting questions have all been answered and the experiments should stop. And the disasters themselves, the glue gun and the bread and the wall and the 6 other incidents the fan community tends affectionately, are the evidence that she is still, in all the ways that matter most, the person who climbed trees in Ohio in 1895 and broke her leg and felt things too completely for her circumstances to hold. She's been a vampire for over 80 years. She still brings total commitment to every interesting problem. She still follows an idea to its full extent. She still arrives somewhere extraordinary by going further than caution would have advised. The family does not wish this were different. The family has organized its systems around the full reality of it and called the organization home. return one final time to the cliff, not to the woman standing at its edge, but to the woman on the other side of it. The woman who woke in the cool dark and chose. The woman who carried a memory of a kind doctor through 10 years of a very hard life, and found him again at the end of it, and built a century of love from that finding. The woman who kept Edward's room ready and Rosalie's beauty honoured and Jasper's belonging unconditional and Emmett's joy protected, and the whole extraordinary, improbable family inside a home she made from every house she ever restored, and every person she ever rebuilt, and every disaster she ever generated, and every loaf of bread she ever made for people who could not eat it, but who understood immediately and completely what it meant that she had made it. She was not the most dramatic Cullen. She was not the most gifted in the formal catalogue sense, did not have an entry between telepathy and precognition, did not drive the plot of any single book with a supernatural ability that changed the shape of events. She stood in doorways, she kept rooms, she held the warmth steady, but the doorways she stood in were the ones the broken people walked through on their way to becoming family. The rooms she kept were the ones those people came back to when the world outside became too much. The warmth she held steady was the thing that made the difference across a century of immortal life, between a collection of extraordinary and damaged individuals sharing an address and a family that was genuinely, durably, extraordinarily that, a family chosen and kept and loved into being by a woman who had been to the bottom of loss and come back with enough love left to build a home for everyone who needed one. She was the most important Cullen, not despite the quietness, because of it, because she understood, in a way that the more visibly dramatic members of the family were still learning across their early decades, that the most important work is rarely the most visible, and that the things that hold everything together are almost always the things that no one thinks to look at until they are gone. She held everything together for a century, starting from a cliff in Wisconsin in 1921, with nothing but a heartbeat too stubborn to stop, and a love too large for any single human life to have contained it. That is the theory. That is Esme Cullen. And she was always hiding in plain sight, the most extraordinary one of all. So, let that sit with you as you drift. A woman who jumped from a cliff and woke up choosing love, who took strangers and made them family, who restored broken houses and broken people with the same patient, unwavering hands, who burned bread and destroyed walls and left glue guns unattended and was beloved for every single bit of it. She was never in the background. We were just not looking carefully enough. For now, let Esme's story carry you somewhere warm and quiet. Let the image of her stay, the open door, the kept room, the love that never ran out, the light that was always on when someone needed to come home. You do not have to hold anything tightly tonight. Let it all go soft. Close your eyes now. Breathe slowly and let the quiet find you. Sweet dreams, my moonlit wanderers. I will be here when you wake. Good night.